Now, following the KwaZulu-Natal floods, which claimed over 400 lives, a group of experts from various fields are calling on government to take a multi-disciplinary approach to mitigate the impact of climate change. The appeal was sounded during a webinar by the University of KwaZulu-Natal, looking at the impact of the floods on urbanisation and vulnerability of communities. For more on this, we're joined by Bobby Peake, who is the director of Groundwork, a non-profit environmental justice organisation based in Durban. Bobby, very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. You've come together as a group of people who are concerned with what the effects of climate change are doing within South Africa. Talk to us about your webinar and what sort of conversations were had when it comes to mitigating factors.
So thank you for having me on. And the webinar was made up of academics, of community based organizations such as the Abashlali, Basamanjondol, Groundwork, as well as a disaster management PhD student. And what was clear from the discussion is that we need to get to grips with governance in our city. We need to be able to develop a plan that is open and democratic to rebuild the city. And we need to be able to listen more to people on the ground to ensure that whatever future plans are made, it's made with the people that are going to be most affected. We must remember that this was not a natural disaster. This was climate change in action. We are living in climate change. We've had floods in 2022, 2019, 2017, 2007, 1987, and 1976. And so it's a reality now, and we need to be able to work speedily, urgently, but with a long vision to be able to rebuild the city of eThekwini.
And looking at the long vision, I know that the discussions also spoke to a short-term plan, which really speaks to the urgency and the desperation of the people on the ground who are left without homes, many thousands displaced, and of course those who have since passed on.
So the South Durban Community Environmental Alliance, one of South Africa's oldest environmental justice community-based organizations, have said since 1995 that we need a preparedness plan for a disaster. We need a disaster management plan to manage the disaster and the outfall when it happens. And we need a recovery plan to be able to learn from the mistakes and be able to then build back better or to not repeat those mistakes. So that is the first thing that has to be considered, that the city has been warned about this. And it's important to recognize that there is an urgent need to be able to rehouse people, to be able to stabilize banks that are still falling on people's homes, to provide water for people. I was, digging in water, and in that water that was coming down the valley was laden with sewage. So, there is the potential for a disease outbreak here. So climate change, we must remember, while it looks like an issue that is out there, climate change has serious health impacts. And the health impacts are what we're going to be suffering from over the next few days. So we need, or the next week, so we need an urgent rebuild of water pipes, getting fresh water to people, shelter to people, food to people, and rebuild the roads. But when we rebuild the roads and rebuild the service infrastructure, we need to think of what is needed urgently, knowing that when we repair that road, it's going to be washed away in the next flood. But we have to open that road. Then what is the 5-year plan? What's the 10-year plan? And what's the 30-year plan? To be able to rebuild the entire city so that we're climate resilient. And what I mean by that is the majority, you often hear about climate change, but people in townships are not worried about climate change. What people in townships are worried about is good services, good homes, good energy, and those services, if you build them well, it will mean we will be resilience against the climate change impacts.
As you make mention of people in townships not being worried about climate change, I mean, it also speaks now and points to the private sector. What can the private sector do to minimize greenhouse emissions?
So a very important, reality is that we need mitigation. We need to stop the greenhouse gas emissions and life after coal. A coalition of organizations such as the Center for Environmental Rights, Earthlife, Groundwork, and community organizations in Amalasheni, in Ermelo, in Newcastle, we are saying we have to shift our coal-based economy into an economy, a new industrialization strategy that speaks to clean, affordable energy. That means renewable energy. But that renewable energy shift must service people first. It cannot service big industry. So what happens as we speak now, Sasol is talking about hydrogen. Sasol wants to be saved because they know they have to stop coal, but they want to be saved by government and start green hydrogen and, a hydrogen economy. It should not be public money that saves Sasol. Public money must save people and develop affordable energy for people, decent jobs for people, and rehabilitate the damaged lands. And Sasol needs to rehabilitate the damaged lands. And what we call that, Paul, is a just transition. The president has said there has to be a just transition, and that just transition must leave no one behind. The Presidential Commission is meeting to discuss the framework for just transition next week, Thursday and Friday in Johannesburg. And for us to have a successful just transition, we have to change our economy so that the economy speaks to people services first and then to industrial profits. And what do I mean by that? Last year, the mining companies that caused climate change, those mining companies made super profits, the highest profits they had ever made in history. But our unemployment rate was at the highest in history. So we can see growing the economy does not mean jobs for people.
Absolutely. And in just weighing in, we've listened to Environmental Affairs Minister Barbara Creecy speaking to the most vulnerable people in society, bearing the burden of climate injustice, which also speaks to an even more perhaps detailed conversation around who is now sitting with the burden of climate change, the poor, the impoverished, with not much ammunition to really better their lives.
Well, they do have ammunition. Let's be very clear about that. I think Minister Creecy is right in a statement that the poor suffer the most. But there is ammunition, and the ammunition sits with Minister Creecy and the President. They need to spend money on redeveloping townships, on making them resilient, providing better transport services for people, better health services for people, better clinics for people. Because once you do that, that's when society will be resilient against climate change. And that's why I said in townships, people are not necessarily worried about climate change, the narrative of climate change. People in townships who are going to be affected by climate change want good services. And if we develop good services for people, Minister Creecy, we will have a resilient society and the poor will not suffer. But what are we doing now? We are facilitating an extractive economy that makes super profits for companies rather than super services for people.
KZN flood relief funds are being rolled out. Of course, there's a lot of eyes watching whether or not the funds will be, used for corrupt elements or benefit the people on the ground. When it comes to the strategy that's being put in place as to where the repair needs to happen and who will be allocated and tasked with those duties, what do you make, just reading from the outside, on the action plan? Will it be sufficient when it comes to a short-term plan and perhaps a longer-term plan in the 10 to 20-year margin?
So we need to recognize that we have the National Disaster Fund that is going to now land in KwaZulu-Natal in Ethekwini. And what Groundwork has been saying for many years, and we said that on the $8.5 billion financial package that was promised to the South African government in Glasgow at COP26, is that the money that comes into South Africa and into responding to this crisis in KwaZulu-Natal must be transparent. We are not government. We don't hold the money. But we want to know, what is government doing with the money? How it is being used? And it has to be government talking with community people who were in the flood zones, talking to them to say, how do we rebuild your city in an open and transparent manner? And what we have been talking about for many years is an open democracy. That means all of that should be in the public domain, so you and I know where and how the money is being spent. The plan to rebuild KwaZulu-Natal, sadly, there is no plan. Let's be very clear about this. So if government says there's a plan, there is no plan. Because today, on Freedom Day, on the 27th of this month, I was in Dassenhoek, in Chilinyama, and we were sadly in a place where people are living in a community hall because their homes have been washed away. People were burying their loved ones.
Yeah.
People still don't know where some of their loved ones are. So there is no plan. And the plan that has to be developed, and the government should have learned from the 2019 floods and the 2017 floods, that you have to do this not by yourself. Government can't act by themselves. They must act with you and I and with the communities that have been affected.
Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in there. Bobby Peake, the director of Groundwork, a non-profit environmental justice organization based in Durban.